The clock read 11:56 p.m., and a faint drizzle pattered on the window, casting rivulets of water down the glass in winding, twisting patterns. 5 friends huddled around a table in the corner of an old cafe on the outskirts of a remote village. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and damp earth, and each of them bore expressions ranging from excitement to apprehension. They were the mystery seekers: Hannah, Mark, Sophie, Josh, and Clara, avid thrill seekers with a shared YouTube channel dedicated to exploring local legends and haunted sites. Their channel had grown popular, primarily due to the group's adventurous spirit and knack for tracking down places most locals avoided. Their last investigation, a supposedly haunted asylum, had brought them 100,000 new subscribers. But tonight, they had gathered to discuss a mysterious new lead, one that had come from an anonymous tip just days earlier. Hannah, the leader, a tall, level-headed young woman with piercing green eyes and a calming presence, opened her laptop and reread the email aloud. Her voice wavered slightly as she read the words. "The Hallowed Burrow," she began, looking around the table, her eyes resting on each of them as if assessing their willingness. "It's an ancient site in the heart of the Dark Pines Forest. It's forbidden ground. Locals say those who enter do not return. Strange sounds, like whispers and screams, echo from the depths. Only those willing to face their deepest fears should enter." A hush fell over the group as they absorbed the words. Mark, a tall, wiry man with a mischievous glint in his eye, let out a nervous chuckle. "Sounds like someone's really trying to scare us off," he said, though his voice held a note of doubt. Mark always joked to cover up his nervousness. Josh, the tech guy of the group, raised an eyebrow. "I mean, come on. It could be an elaborate prank or just some local legend to keep people out of the woods," he said, trying to keep the mood light. "We've seen weirder things, right?" Clara, the quietest of the group, shivered. She was the team's historian, a gentle soul with a passion for uncovering the stories behind the places they visited. She glanced out the rain-streaked window, her reflection almost blending with the darkness outside. "There are usually roots in these legends," she murmured, almost to herself. "They come from somewhere, something real." Sophie, the group skeptic, was watching Hannah closely. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her tone soft but resolute. Hannah nodded slowly. "We've covered abandoned buildings, haunted cemeteries, even an underground tunnel once. But this feels different. And we've never had a tip this specific, with so many warnings." As the rain continued to fall, Hannah looked around at her friends, each of them lost in their thoughts. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "So, are we in?" There was a collective murmur of agreement, with Mark throwing in a sarcastic, "I guess dying in a creepy forest is better than studying for exams." The village locals didn't help their nerves when they asked for directions to the Dark Pines Forest. The waitress who had served them coffee paled and warned them to turn back. An elderly man outside the cafe muttered about how the forest was a graveyard of the lost, and spoke of monstrous beings who would twist your memories and mimic loved ones. It seemed everyone in the village had their own version of the same tale. But for the mystery seekers, the warning only made them more curious. As they gathered their gear and prepared for the journey, each of them felt a heavy weight settle over their hearts. Something in that old man's hollow stare lingered with them as they left the warm light of the cafe and ventured into the thick, rain-soaked forest. They couldn't have known that the old man's last words, "The burrow knows your soul," would haunt them for every step they took toward the abyss. After hours of hiking through the dense, fog-draped trees, they finally reached the entrance to the Hallowed Burrow. It was far larger than they had expected, a dark, gaping mouth in the side of a moss-covered hill. The entrance was ringed with ancient stones, each etched with strange, twisting runes that looked half-worn with time. Faint claw marks marred the stones near the entrance, adding an eerie sense of danger. A chilling gust of wind seemed to breathe from the mouth of the burrow, carrying a faint, metallic tang that made them shiver. The friends exchanged wary glances before Mark, trying to keep up his usual bravado, stepped forward and shone his flashlight into the darkness. "Nothing but rocks and old dust," he said, but his voice trembled. Josh and Sophie stepped forward, each lighting up the tunnel with their flashlights. The darkness swallowed the beams, making the space feel endless, a void that beckoned them deeper. Inside, they felt a strange heaviness in the air, a quiet stillness that went beyond silence. It felt as if the burrow itself was alive, waiting, watching. Shadows flickered on the walls, dancing to the rhythm of their shaky breaths. "This place is ancient," Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on the carvings lining the walls. She brushed her hand over one of the symbols, a twisted figure that seemed to stare back at her. "These symbols, they're warnings. They're trying to keep something in." The rest of the group moved closer, examining the eerie carvings. Grotesque figures with elongated arms and hollow eyes, open mouths twisted in expressions of silent screams. Sophie shuddered as her fingers brushed against one, its texture cold and rough under her skin. "Look at this one," Josh muttered, pointing at a particularly disturbing figure. Its face was distorted, almost like it was shifting between two expressions. It had two hollow eyes, one round and innocent, the other sharp and malevolent. Just as they moved further into the burrow, a faint whisper echoed through the tunnel. "Help me." The voice was soft and pleading, and the group froze, their blood running cold. It sounded like Clara's voice, but wrong, distorted, as if filtered through something ancient and terrible. Clara turned, wide-eyed, as if trying to assure herself that the voice wasn't hers. Mark laughed nervously. "Nice try, Clara," he said, though his face was pale. Clara shook her head slowly, her face pale and stricken. "That wasn't me," she whispered, fear thickening her voice. The whispers began to grow louder, echoing down the tunnel, overlapping until they formed a chorus of desperate, pleading voices. "Come play. I remember you. Don't leave me." Each voice was distorted, taking on strange, shifting qualities, as if it was being twisted and stretched. Some voices sounded young, others old, some too guttural and inhuman. They began to feel as if 100 invisible eyes were watching them from every corner, every shadow of the burrow. "Let's keep moving," Hannah said, trying to keep the group together. But she could feel the fear mounting, pressing in on them like a physical weight. As they moved deeper, the carvings on the walls grew more elaborate, showing scenes of twisted rituals, strange figures praying to monstrous shapes that seemed to writhe on the stone. The deeper they went, the more the images seemed to blur and distort, as if they were shifting beneath their gaze. Then, as they rounded a corner, Mark stopped abruptly. There, standing just a few feet in front of him, was a little girl. She was wearing a white dress, her long hair hanging over her face. She stood still, her face obscured, but something about her figure seemed wrong, distorted. Mark's heart pounded as he took a step back, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. "Mark," Sophie whispered, noticing his expression. "What's wrong?" The little girl lifted her head slowly, and Mark felt his blood freeze. It was his sister, his little sister who had passed away years ago in a tragic accident. She stared at him, her eyes hollow and her mouth twisted into a haunting grin that was both familiar and grotesque. "Come play, Mark," she whispered, her voice low and guttural, completely unlike his sister's soft, innocent voice. He stumbled back, almost tripping over his own feet. When he looked back up, she was gone. The group pressed onward, their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel as the weight of their fear grew with every step. The darkness seemed thicker, almost palpable, as though they were walking through something alive, something breathing. Shadows shifted around them, slipping just out of sight but always present, watching. Their flashlights flickered, casting dancing beams of light that only added to the eerie atmosphere. As they moved deeper, the voices grew louder, more insistent. Each friend heard something different, snippets of laughter, whispers of regret, or the faintest sound of someone crying. It was Sophie who first broke the silence. Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight with dread. They paused, listening. Somewhere ahead, faint strains of a lullaby floated through the air, soft and haunting. Sophie's face went pale. That's my mom's lullaby," she stammered, looking around at her friends, her eyes wide with terror. "She used to sing that to me when I was little." The others exchanged glances, unease rippling through them. They had all heard the voices, but this was different. The melody was too real, too familiar. "Maybe it's the echo playing tricks on us," Mark suggested, though his voice was barely above a whisper. But the lullaby grew louder, its melody twisting and warping until it sounded distorted, unnatural. Sophie began to shake, gripping her flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, as they rounded a bend, the song stopped abruptly. Standing just a few feet away was a figure, a woman with her back turned, swaying slightly as if to the rhythm of the lullaby. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, hiding her face. Sophie's heart raced. "Mom!" she whispered, taking an involuntary step forward. Hannah grabbed her arm. "Sophie, no. It's not real." But Sophie couldn't hear her. She took another step forward, her gaze fixed on the figure. The woman began to turn, slowly, revealing a face that was both familiar and wrong. It looked like her mother, but the eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth was stretched into an unnatural smile, too wide, the lips cracked and bleeding. "Come closer, Sophie," the figure crooned in a voice that was her mother's, but deeper, more menacing. Sophie stumbled back, her breath hitching in her throat. She blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only silence and darkness. I saw her," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It was my mom, but it wasn't. Whatever's down here, it's playing with our minds," Josh said, his voice tense. "We need to stay together, keep moving." They continued deeper into the burrow, but the atmosphere grew heavier, oppressive. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air was thick with a metallic tang, almost like blood. Clara, who had been unusually quiet, stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on something in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others paused, listening. There, faintly, was the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the tunnel. It was soft and playful, but there was an edge to it, something twisted and wrong. Mark's face drained of color. "No, it can't be." The laughter grew louder, and from the shadows emerged a small figure. A little girl in a faded dress, her dark hair hanging over her face. She looked up, and Mark gasped. It was his little sister, Emma, who had died in a car accident when he was just a child. She smiled, her face eerily innocent, but her eyes were empty, hollow. "Come play with me, Mark," she said, her voice distorted, echoing off the walls. Mark took a step back, his hands shaking. "Emma, you're gone." But the figure only laughed, a high-pitched, unsettling sound that sent chills down their spines. She took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, her limbs elongating as she moved. Her smile stretched wider, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Play with me," she hissed, her voice losing its sweetness, turning into something guttural and inhuman. Mark stumbled backward, crashing into the others as he scrambled to get away. Hannah grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the terror. They sprinted down the tunnel, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The laughter echoed behind them, growing louder, as if the creature was following them. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating them as they ran. Finally, they reached a wider chamber, the walls covered in carvings that seemed to writhe and twist under their gaze. They stopped, panting, their hearts pounding as they looked around. The whispers had stopped, and the silence was deafening. Josh shined his flashlight on the carvings, his hands shaking. The figures etched into the stone were monstrous, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. They seemed to depict scenes of torment, figures twisted in agony as shadowy creatures loomed over them. "What is this place?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like a shrine," Hannah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But to what?" Before anyone could respond, a new voice echoed through the chamber, a voice they all recognized. "Help me," it pleaded, weak and desperate. They turned, and there, at the edge of the light, was Clara, or something that looked like her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror as she reached out to them, her fingers twisting in unnatural ways. "Clara?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure took a step forward, but something about her was wrong. Her limbs were too long, her joints bending at impossible angles. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her eyes hollow and dark. "Help me," she repeated, her voice distorted, echoing off the walls. The real Clara backed away, her face pale with horror. That's not me," she whispered. The creature lunged, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with its strings cut. The friends scattered, their screams echoing through the chamber as they scrambled to escape. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its hollow eyes fixed on them as it pursued them through the tunnels. As they ran, the creature's voices filled the air, echoing off the walls in a twisted symphony of whispers and screams. Each voice was familiar, haunting them with memories and regrets, drawing them deeper into the burrow. They regrouped in a narrow passage, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick with fear, and each of them cast wary glances at each other, as if doubting the reality of their own friends. We need a plan," Hannah said, her voice trembling but resolute. "These things are using our memories, our voices. We need a way to know who's real." Josh nodded, his face pale. "We need a code, something only we would know." They agreed on a phrase, something simple, a shared inside joke from their channel. Each of them would repeat it, proving their humanity to the others. But as they moved forward, the creature's tactics grew more insidious. The whispers became more personal, targeting each of their fears and insecurities. Mark heard his father's voice, cold and disappointed, echoing through the darkness. Sophie heard her own voice, mocking her doubts and failures. Josh heard a child's laughter, innocent and sweet, but tinged with something sinister. The group grew more fragmented, each member retreating into their own mind, haunted by the voices. The creatures seemed to feed on their fear, their doubt, growing stronger with each passing moment. Hannah struggled to keep them together, her voice a beacon in the darkness. But even she began to falter, her own memories surfacing, twisting into nightmarish visions. In a final, desperate bid to escape, they ran through the tunnels, using their code to reassure each other. The creatures pursued them, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness, their twisted forms moving with unnatural speed. They burst out of the burrow, gasping for air, the sunlight blinding after the oppressive darkness. They collapsed on the forest floor, laughing hysterically with relief. But as they caught their breath, a shadow fell over them. They looked up, and there, standing at the edge of the burrow, was a familiar figure. A figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It was Clara, or something that looked like her. And as they watched in horror, she raised a hand, her voice echoing through the forest in a chilling, distorted whisper. "Don't leave me." The friends stumbled backward, their hearts pounding as they realized the truth. They hadn't escaped. The burrow had followed them,